Thank you. Chris Gallis from New Energy Directions. Professor Garnaut, you suggested that the Australia Fund be used to finance the extension of the grid to the new forms of energy. How would you see such a division being brought about between, for instance, wind and geothermal, if we're looking at South Australia, as wind is on the coast and geothermal is inland? How would you see the economics of deciding which way you are going to extend the grid? Because it would seem that the economics of extending it both ways would be quite formidable.
That's a really hard question, and we discussed it at some length in chapter 17 of the draft report. The challenge, you can't put a transmission line out to wherever anyone wants to put in some renewable capacity. You have to have priorities. There are big advantages in consolidating renewables production for distant markets in a limited number of centres so that we reduce the costs of the additional transmission. We discuss the mechanisms for considering those matters. We draw attention to what is going on in other countries. California, for example, has made a very big effort of this kind and has got an elaborate process for determining these outcomes. We're not necessarily advocating that, but we think we can learn from that. The United Kingdom has elaborate processes that we draw attention to, but you've raised very important issues, and making sure that we have in mind all of the alternatives and that we're examining opportunities for concentrating renewables production along certain routes can lower the cost. In the end, there will be a need for decisions that will be favourable to some locations and not to others. As much as possible, they should be based on objective criteria related to the potential for power coming from different regions and the costs of linking them.
Professor Garnaut, my name is Tony O'Malley. My questions are largely around risk management. I'm in favour of emissions trading scheme. There are two risks I'd like you to bear in mind. One is, if we fail to mitigate, we need a parachute, we need a lifeboat. And I would ask you why you have not allocated some of the funds emerging from the emissions trading scheme towards constructing the lifeboat. My second question is, we have in South Australia a lot of experience with people setting caps on resources that we require and then overspending them interstate. Why are you not proposing credible commitments that would determine the size of the caps so that our interests, as they were not in the Murray-Darling Basin, are protected?
Well, we think that the setting of the trajectories for emissions reduction need to be based on the sort of work that we're engaged in, so they will be realistic and credible caps. On adaptation, we think that's an important part of the story for the reasons I've already mentioned. Even if we're very successful in mitigation on a global level from now on, we'll be living with some pretty awful effects because what's already in the atmosphere will be having a warming effect over the next couple of decades. Even if we stopped emissions growth globally now, we're not going to do that. So adaptation is an important part of the story. We'll have extensive discussion of that in the final report. The resources for that we'll be suggesting need to build up over time from the general revenues of government. The resources generated by sales of permits will be fully committed to the tasks that we've allocated them to, but that's not the whole of public funding that's available for adaptation.
My name is Catherine Wells. I'm a climate change consultant to Finlayson's lawyers in Adelaide here and former chair of Premier Rand's Sustainability Roundtable. Professor Garnaut, thank you for the work you and your team are doing. It's making a tremendous contribution to the current debate. The thing that concerns me is the speed at which the science of climate change is moving. Just 5 years ago, here in Adelaide, the cutting edge of the targets debate was the notion that we should have 20% cuts by 2020. But now, because of the work of scientists such as Dr. James Hansen from NASA and the opinions of scientists such as Professor Barry Brooks from our own Adelaide University, the cutting edge of the debate here on targets is really the notion that we should be aiming for negative emissions cuts over the coming decades. So the science is moving incredibly quickly. It seems to me that it's not likely that the current political debate can keep up with that science. So my question really is this. I perceive a need for us to design very flexible institutions and arrangements as we go forward. I'm sure this is something you've given some thought to. Could you tell us what you've done to try and put flexibility into your version of the ETS?
Yes. It's not only the science that has developed. The science is based on certain assumptions about business as usual growth in emissions. The work for our review has reworked a lot of those business as usual assumptions, and that's reported in Chapter 4, and that is in the process of changing what the world thinks about the business as usual growth in global emissions. So what we've done is reworked what the International Energy Agency, what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put into their models, and it was that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that produced the business as usual emissions projections that Nick Stern used in the Stern report. We think that we've analysed that work, and we've come to the view that they've greatly underestimated the business as usual growth in emissions, mainly because they've underestimated what's happening in the big developing countries, China, India, Indonesia and others. I start from the point of view that it is a wonderful thing that rapid economic growth is occurring in these developing countries. It's taking more people out of poverty more quickly than ever in human history, but we have to recognise the side effect of that is very rapid growth in emissions. And our work reported in Chapter 4 shows that if we don't do anything in mitigation, the world will have the level of emissions in 2030 that Nick Stern in the Stern report said we would have in 2050. So quite apart from development of the science, a realistic approach to what's happening in business as usual brings forward the critical dates, makes everything more urgent, and you're quite right about the tendencies in the science. We very briefly in the draft report mentioned that the need for more investment in applied climate science in Australia, and we'll be saying more about that in the final report. But the most important thing we're doing in flexibility is that when we make our recommendations on targets, and this was foreshadowed in the interim report in February and the discussion paper on the emissions trading scheme in March, and repeated briefly in the draft report, we'll be recommending a target that we think is appropriate for us as one of the developed countries as a first step. And we'll be recommending that we should also say what we are prepared to do, which is a bigger step, in the context of a global agreement to get things together. That will be the source of the flexibility that you're looking forward for. We say in the draft report that something like the government's announced target of minus 60% by 2050 is an appropriate first step as doing broadly what other developed countries are doing. And we'll need to convert that into a 2020 objective as well. But we should also put on the table what we are prepared to do, more than that, possibly much more than that, in the context of the international community getting its act together.